delay. The captain of that capsized ferry delayed the evacuation. Did that cost lives? Seth Doan on the search. A diplomatic breakthrough on Ukraine. Margaret Brennan is covering the talks. Anthony Mason on the pain for Russia. And Holly Williams at the scene of the crisis. Chip Reed on the search for life on the floor of the Gulf after the BP spill.
4 years ago, there was nothing. I saw one crab in an 8-hour dive.
How about now? And Mark Strassman on America's 50-year love affair with a pony.
What'd you think when you first laid eyes?
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. A Mustang.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Kelly. Good evening. More bodies were recovered today from the scene of the ferry disaster off South Korea, but hundreds of people, most of them teenagers from the same school, are presumed to be still aboard the sunken vessel. One anguished parent said, "If I could teach myself to dive, I would jump in the water and try to find my daughter." Nearly 2 days after the ferry capsized, the confirmed death toll stands at 25. Seth Doan is following the search.
Rescuers hammered on the hull of the capsized ferry, hoping for a response. None came. Divers tried to pump in oxygen to help anyone still alive below deck, but strong waves and heavy winds made it impossible. We made 5 to 8 attempts, this Coast Guard chief said, but in the end we have failed to enter the sunken ship. One of the only bright spots was when a 6-year-old was plucked from the ferry. Her parents and brother remain missing. Over 200 passengers are still unaccounted for. Most are high school students. For families, the agonizing wait continued. "Come back alive," pleaded this grandmother. This mother had to identify her teenage son at the local morgue. The 69-year-old captain faces a criminal investigation. He may have been among the first off the sinking ship. "I am so sorry and ashamed," he said. "I am at a loss for words." No one knows why the ferry sank. The state broadcaster said it was possible the cargo, about 1,000 tons, was not tied down properly. It may have shifted suddenly, causing the ship to tilt dangerously. But when the ferry started listing, some survivors say they were told to stay where they were. The evacuation order was not given for another 30 minutes, and many said they never heard it.
Seth Doan is with us from Incheon. Seth, the stern of the ferry is resting on the seabed. Are they going to try to lift the entire boat?
They are, Scott. The government is actually bringing in 3 ships with giant cranes on them. They're going to try to turn over the ship and then lift it up as part of the salvage operation. We did just get off the phone with the Coast Guard, and they reminded us that still it is being termed a rescue.
Seth, thank you very much. There's a surprise agreement tonight that may head off a Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine. The U.S. and Russia, along with Ukraine and the European Union, negotiated a deal in Geneva today where we find our State Department correspondent, Margaret Brennan. Margaret, what happened?
Well, Scott, expectations were low for today's meeting here in Geneva. So when the diplomats actually came to an agreement, Secretary Kerry called it a good day's work. The deal was reached after nearly 7 hours of negotiations. It lays out concrete steps that are meant to help restore security in Ukraine. The agreement requires all illegal armed groups to disarm and hand over seized buildings. In exchange, they'll be granted amnesty. All sides must refrain from violence, extremism, and anti-Semitism. International monitors will help Ukraine's government restore order. And the new Ukrainian government promised to allow greater autonomy to parts of the country, a gesture to the pro-Russian separatists. Kerry said the U.S. and the European Union would hold off on any additional sanctions until they see if Russia and the armed separatists comply with the deal. What is a specific time frame and specific consequences if these steps are not followed through on?
We expect in the next few days, over the course of this weekend and the earliest part of next week,
some of these steps need to begin to be seen and be evident. But if there's a clear indication that this is moving in the right direction, then our president will make his decision, and the leaders in Europe will make their decisions.
Russia has not agreed to withdraw the nearly 40,000 troops that it has stationed along Ukraine's border. But today, the Pentagon said it would send aid to strengthen Ukraine's military. That, though, is only going to be non-lethal gear, items like helmets and sleeping bags.
Margaret Brennan covering for us in Geneva tonight. Thanks, Margaret. Later today, President Obama said this about the deal.
I don't think we can be sure of anything at this point. I think there is the possibility, the prospect, that diplomacy may de-escalate the situation, and we may be able to move towards what has always been our goal, which is let the Ukrainians make their own decisions about their own lives.
But of course, it is the Ukrainians themselves who are divided about their own lives. In the East, more than a third call themselves ethnic Russian. There was a deadly confrontation last night at a base along the Black Sea, and Holly Williams is there.
Eastern Ukraine's simmering tensions exploded last night as pro-Russian separatists fought with the country's National Guard outside their base in Mariupol. Ukraine's government said 3 militants were killed and another 13 injured. In the aftermath, the two sides blamed each other for the bloodshed. This is the worst violence Eastern Ukraine has seen since its insurgency began, and it's only going to add to the anger and mistrust felt on both sides. The vice commander on the base told us today his men fired warning shots first and only fired at the militants after they broke into the compound, throwing Molotov cocktails. But in a local hospital, guarded by police, we found Sergei Shevchenko, a pro-Russian separatist who said he was hit by shrapnel from a grenade thrown by a soldier. He told us the protesters did nothing to provoke the shooting. Do you think it's possible for both sides to calm down now and stop the violence?
No.
Yes, he told us, if we have a referendum, we want a separate state here in eastern Ukraine.
Despite today's diplomatic deal in Geneva, there's a deepening divide here between those who support Ukraine's Western-backed government in Kiev and those in the east of the country who lean towards Russia. And Scott, last night's violence won't bring them any closer together.
Holly Williams in eastern Ukraine. Thank you, Holly. Now, the West has already imposed economic sanctions against Russia for its seizure earlier of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. We asked senior business correspondent Anthony Mason to find out whether those sanctions have any bite.
Even before Russia massed troops on the Ukrainian border, its economy was faltering.
Would you say sanctions are working?
The existing sanctions are starting to chip away at the economic welfare of Russian elites and Russian companies.
Alex Clement, head of Russian research at the Eurasia Group, says the turmoil over Ukraine is scaring away international investors.
Attracting fresh money is becoming more difficult for Russian companies and for Russian banks.
Russia's economy actually shrank in the first 3 months of the year by 0.5%. This week, Russia's economic minister, Alexei Ulyukayev, called it a very worrying situation. Foreign and Russian companies are sending cash out of the country to safe havens. $64 billion fled in the first 3 months of this year. That's more than left Russia in all of 2013.
Could broader sanctions tilt Russia into recession?
Broader sanctions could absolutely tilt Russia into recession. I think at the moment, the prospect of broader sanctions against the Russian economy is one of the things that is restraining the Kremlin's willingness to actually invade eastern Ukraine. Right?
For now, Clement says, Putin's popularity at home is soaring on a wave of nationalistic fervor.
Underneath that is a real risk that this economic weakness can start to hollow out that support very quickly.
The West hoped that a first wave of sanctions would serve as a warning shot, forcing Putin to consider that the price for taking control of Ukraine may be an economic crisis in Russia. Anthony Mason, CBS News, New York.
Today, President Obama talked up the recent success in getting Americans to enroll in insurance plans under the Affordable Care Act. 8 million have now signed up, and 35% are under the age of 35. The president said, quote, "This thing is working." In California today, accident investigators staged a partial recreation of last week's deadly collision of a FedEx truck and a bus filled with teenagers. They're trying to determine how it happened. Also today, 911 calls from the fiery tragedy were released. Ben Tracy is following the investigation.
Reporting. I was in a car accident. I was on a travel bus, and we crashed into a FedEx truck.
The 911 calls describe the horrific scene. A FedEx truck and a bus full of high school students on fire.
Bus is on fire. I understand that. Are you away from it, or are you still on it? Yeah, we're getting away from the bus, actually.
Of the 10 people who died in the crash, 5 of them were students. Today, the California Highway Patrol conducted tests on the same stretch of freeway with a FedEx truck and a tour bus. Captain Todd Morrison explained why.
So that we can hopefully identify, get as closely as we can, the pre-impact speeds of both of these vehicles. We're hoping to learn how it happened so that we can identify what to do to prevent it from happening again.
Investigators did recover black box-like devices from both vehicles, which would have recorded speed, acceleration, and braking, but they were heavily damaged in the fire. Both state and federal investigators plan to examine cell phone records of the FedEx driver, cell phone video of the accident, and are looking into what kind of cargo was inside the FedEx truck. The crash occurred about 100 miles north of Sacramento. The bus was carrying 44 students from Southern California to Humboldt State University for a tour.
I watched a person burn alive. I can never forget that.
18-year-old Miles Hill kicked open a window on the bus. That allowed 20 people to escape.
I have really bad nightmares about it. Every time I close my eyes, I just hear screaming. I hear boom. I see fire.
All of the injured students are now out of the hospital, and the accident investigation is expected to take months. Ben Tracy, CBS News, Los Angeles.
Today, a literary giant, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, died at his home in Mexico City. The winner of the Nobel Prize in 1982, his appeal was worldwide, drawing comparisons to Mark Twain and Charles Dickens. Through novels and short stories, Gabriel Garcia Marquez introduced readers to Latin America, which he described as a source of insatiable creativity, full of sorrow and beauty. His 1967 novel, 100 Years of Solitude, sold 50 million copies in more than 25 languages. Garcia Marquez pioneered the style known as magic realism, the blending of the plausible with the miraculous. He was an early supporter of Cuba's Fidel Castro, and politics forced him to leave his native Colombia in 1981. He spent the rest of his life in Mexico. Last month, though battling cancer and dementia, Garcia Marquez greeted a crowd that had come to celebrate his 87th birthday. 4 years after the BP spill, has the Gulf recovered? We'll dive to the bottom of the sea. And a surprise announcement from the